This morning we're going to begin a sermon series, and if you notice, I think it's on Genesis. We're going to walk through Genesis together. Genesis is an interesting book, and we get the question sometimes why, or at least I had the question, why? Why Genesis, God? Why are you bringing us back to the beginning? And I wasn't totally sure, and actually as I was praying, God reminded me, he says, remember Old Testament class? When you walked in and Golden Gay said, on the very first day, we all sat down, we got out he said, get out your Bible, pull it out, open it up to Malachi chapter 4, verse 6. Anybody know what Malachi 4, verse 6 is? If you've memorized it, I'll be even more impressed. Malachi chapter 4, verse 6 is the last verse of the Old Testament. It's the very last one. And he says, there it is, right there. At that verse, I want you to take this book, tear the binding, and throw the back half away. Because everything you need to know is for the gospel is found in the Old Testament. And of course, all of us who grew up in the church went, what are you talking about? And he says, I'm kidding. I'm not really saying throw away the New Testament. It's not that it's not important. But he says it is. The story of the Old Testament tells us of the Messiah, who is here, who we just sang about is worthy, the one. He is the fulfillment of this story. And so it's so important for us to know the story, to know God. And so one of the things that we're going to do with this is kind of begin to walk through the story and look at it from a story standpoint. When we read the scriptures in a Western context, our Western mind has been influenced by our Western thinking, which is very pragmatic, logical, detail, factually oriented. We look for the path, tell me what to do, tell me the steps to take, tell me how it is. The Bible was written in a Near East context. It was written in was written by authors who were in Jewish contexts, who were Hebrew. They read and think a little bit differently. They read and think in terms of pictures. This give me a picture. If you ask somebody to talk about their character, if I asked, I'll pick on Caden, because I didn't ask Theo if I could pick on him. If somebody were to ask me about my son's character, what kind of kid is Caden? And I said he's hardworking, right? I'm giving you a fact. I'm giving you a specific thing. But when I want to know what I mean by that or show that to me, I'm going to tell you a story, right? So to tell you the story, my son is a hardworking individual. The previous church that we were at was Covenant Grove. And when we started there, when Caden was about 10 years old, the church bought a building. And as we bought that building, we began to renovate that building to prepare for our congregation to come in. And as we built that as we were in that space and we were building the stage area and things like that, we were renovating it. And the design was to put up this kind of wood paneling kind of stuff in the back. And so for 2 days, as we were setting up that stage and we were doing that decor, there was a 10-year-old boy who stood at a chop saw. And all he did all day. And I'd call out a number. I need 48 and a half inches. I need 37 and a quarter. And this 10-year-old boy would crank them out. To understand his character, we tell a story. And oftentimes as we look at the Old Testament, we have to understand that that's kind of the context in which the Old Testament was written. It's meant to read that way. Not that we can't read it for facts and details. We're going to talk next week about Genesis chapter 1. That's going to be a fun chapter, right? We often in the West read it from a very factual standpoint. 7 days, these things created, this order. Again, we're looking at facts. there's some things that's really interesting as we begin to put it into a Jewish context and understand it from the Jewish story. But we want to kind of do that with the whole of Genesis. Genesis is a book that is attributed to, authorship is attributed to Moses. Most academics, as they study it, it looks kind of like Moses's collection of sermons. From a Jewish standpoint, they read it a little bit like that. These are teachings that Moses was giving to the nation of Israel. And then he decided, you know what? I probably should just write this all down instead of just keep telling you this story. It's 50 chapters long. Don't freak out. We're not going to be in this for 50 months or 50 weeks. We are going to combine some things and that kind of stuff. And today it was like, how am I going to summarize all of that? Because I'm not that great at summarizing things. Theo has done this class where they had Old Testament, they had to summarize an Old Testament book, and Jackie decided to summarize it. And that's actually what this artwork is. This is her final project, where she took and summarized all of Genesis in visual format. And so if you want to come up and check that out sometime, that's fine too. But I'm like, I can't do all that. So I decided, instead of preaching any more than this, I'm going to let somebody else summarize it. And we're going to watch, some of these videos are from a group called the Bible Project, and we're going to watch their summary of the book of Genesis and where they begin to take it and look at the whole picture of Genesis as a whole. So, Peggy, go ahead and roll that.
The first book in the Bible is a book you've probably heard of. It's called Genesis.
Genesis comes from a Hebrew word, it's pronounced reshit, and it just means beginning.
Now, there's a lot of stories from the book of Genesis, and it's easy just to pull out a specific story and try to tell you what it might mean. But we think the best way to understand this book is to look at the book as a whole and show you how the whole thing is designed.
The book is designed to fall into two main parts. You have chapters 1 through 11, which is telling the story of God and the whole world. And then you have the second part, which is about God and Abraham's family, as chapters 12 through 50. And how the two of those parts relate, that's where you find the message of the book.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. The first part of Genesis begins with a creation story where God creates everything.
And how exactly that happens, of course, that's where all the debates come. But he takes a dark, watery chaos and he turns it into a beautiful garden where humans can flourish.
That sounds nice.
It does sound nice. In fact, 7 different times God says of all that he's made that it's good.
And this is where we meet the first human characters in the Bible, Adam and Eve.
They're both individual characters, but they're also representative. Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for life. And God creates them in his image. In other words, humanity reflects, or is meant to reflect, the creativity, the goodness, and character of the Creator out into the world that he's made. And they're supposed to reproduce and make cultures and neighborhoods and art and gardens and everything else. But he gives them a moral
choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about.
And he tells them, don't eat of the fruit of this tree or you will die. What's that all about?
So up till now, God has been the one defining and providing what is good. And so God is the one with the knowledge of good and evil. But now this tree represents a choice. Will the humans trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize the opportunity and define good and evil for themselves?
And Adam and Eve eat the fruit.
This is the core biblical explanation for that concept of sin, that desire to call the shots myself. It's the inward turn of the human heart to do what's good for me and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your tribe.
And the problem is humans are horrible at defining good and evil without God. And so now that humanity's made this choice, things get really
bad. So Genesis 3 through 11 is like tracing this downward spiral of all humanity. So Adam and Eve, they can't trust each other anymore. And so there's a little story about how they were naked and felt fine about it beforehand, but now they feel shameful because all of a sudden Adam's definition of good and evil might be different than Eve's, and so they hide from each other.
Then there's another story of temptation. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he gives in and kills him.
There's a story right after Cain about a guy named Lamech, and all we know about Lamech is that he accumulates wives like property, and he sings songs about how he's a more violent, vengeful person than Cain ever was, and he's proud of it.
Things get so bad with the human race that we see God decide to just wipe us out.
Yeah, we typically think of the flood story as about God being angry, but it actually begins with God's sadness and grief about the state of his world. And so out of his passion to preserve the goodness of his world, he washes it clean with the flood.
But there's a glimmer of hope. He chooses Noah and his whole family, and he saves them on this boat.
Yeah, don't forget about the animals.
Right, and the animals. So Noah and his family are going to reboot all of humanity. I mean, he must be a pretty great guy.
But this is the story most people don't know because it's kind of weird, is that Noah gets off the boat and he plants a vineyard and he gets totally plastered, and then something sketchy happens in his tent with his son. It's a tragic story.
So from here, humanity grows again, but things are as bad as before. And the last story is the famous story of the Tower of Babel.
And in this story, you have all of the nations uniting together to use this new technology they have, the brick. And they want to make a name for themselves and build this big city with a huge tower that will reach up to the gods. But God knows that this city will be a nightmare. And so in his mercy, he scatters them. And all of these stories, they're underlining the same basic idea. When humans seize autonomy from God, when they define good and evil for themselves, it results in a world of tragedy and death.
And this leaves you wondering, is there any hope for humanity?
Yes, yeah, there is. It's the very next story that answers that question. It's the beginning of God's mission to rescue and restore his world.
So how do we get from the Tower of Babel to the story here in the middle?
Well, after the scattering at Babel, there's this genealogy, and it follows one of the tribes all the way down to this one guy named Abram.
You probably know him as Abraham.
And God starts making all these promises to Abraham, like he's going to bless him and give him a ton of kids. And he says that through him and his family, all the nations of the earth are now going to find God's blessing. So basically, God is trying to restore humanity back to the goodness of the garden and to his original intentions for the world. So it's like his rescue plan for humanity. And that's why the whole second half of Genesis is about this one family. And so you have Abraham, and then he has his son Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And to each generation, God renews his promise to bless them and all nations through them.
So because of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, it's pretty easy to read these stories as examples of how to be a good person.
But actually, for the most part, this family is totally dysfunctional. So for example, let's go back to Abraham. This whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family, but 2 different times. He basically gives Sarah away to other men by denying that she's even his wife. And then Sarah gets impatient about having a son, and so she makes Abraham sleep with her servant girl, which then causes all of these other problems in the family.
So they get really old, and you begin to think that there's no way they're going to have a kid of their own. But then, miraculously, they do. It's Isaac.
And Isaac, he has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, and it seems like things are going pretty good.
But Jacob, the younger brother, wants the family's inheritance, which belongs to Esau, the older brother. So he devises a plan where he's going to steal it from his father, Isaac, who at this point in the story is now old and blind.
Which, who does that? Horrible, stealing from your blind father.
Yeah, and then he just takes off.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all the others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat, and his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command.
But we are going to see in this that from the very beginning, Even before God implemented the plan of salvation through his son's death and resurrection. He had that plan from the beginning. He had that plan before he created the world. But even before we got there, the reason he had the plan was because God is a God of grace and mercy, who can take our brokenness and turn it into something good. And so we're just going to take some time and walk through Genesis over the next few weeks. I encourage you to start reading through it. We will have some of these supplemental things in there where you can listen in to those outside of here on your own. You can come and discuss it. But I just encourage you, join us as we walk through Genesis, where it sets the stage and it begins to answer those questions. God, what are you doing in this world? What is it that you're trying to create? We're going to close this service, and one of the things that we're going to do as a part of this sermon series is you've heard the benediction over and over and over, and oftentimes we become very accustomed when we hear things over and over, we don't necessarily reflect on it much. And we're going to continue to use it, but today and several times throughout this sermon series, we're going to close and do a benediction, and it's the benediction you've heard. But today we're going to do it a little bit different, and the choir is going to lead us in our benediction today. And so I just encourage you to hear these words as we close this service today.